In the cold, desolate halls of the sanitarium, where the wind whispered like distant prayers and the air was thick with the weight of forgotten lives, a child lay awake. His small body trembled as visions of the past and the future twisted together in his dreams, blending together in terrifying glimpses of a world beyond mortal comprehension. Though the whitewashed walls promised comfort, they could not contain the divine echo that seeped into his soul. Night after night, the voices came, a ceaseless murmur of cosmic truths that threatened to shatter his mind. The gentle prayers of a kind-hearted nun offered no solace, for these were visions not of this world. The boy's short life had been one of unrelenting torment. From his first moments of awareness, the voices had filled his mind, their weight like iron upon his thoughts. The words themselves eluded him, but their presence was inescapable, a thunder in his veins that threatened to tear him apart. In his dreams, the boy was forced to watch as twisted creatures stalked the world, their forms warped by devotion to those who call the deepest circles of hell home. He watched in horror as these lost souls committed unspeakable acts, their cruelty boundless and their humanity long forgotten. Many nights he would awaken with bloodied fingers, his nails torn and ragged from the desperate attempt to claw his own eyes out. He had never known the warmth of family or the comfort of a mother's touch. Long before he could name the things he saw, the church had claimed him, placing him within the cold embrace of the sanitarium. There, in the echoing halls, he lay in darkness, his only companions the visions that refused to let him sleep. The nuns taught the boy how to pray, to kneel and clasp his hands, to bow his head in reverence to the Lord of Christendom. They spoke of angels and saints, of worship and penance, and of the quiet strength to be found in devotion. Under their gentle guidance, the boy found in prayer a fragile haven, a sliver of calm amid the storm of visions. Though the voices never truly ceased, in prayer they quieted from a hurricane to a raging river, still fierce and dangerous, but not entirely overwhelming. In these moments, he learned to endure the ceaseless echoes, and he clung to each prayer like a lifeline that kept him from being swept away. During the boy's 15th year at the sanitarium, a delegation arrived in the dead of night. The boy, by then accustomed to the cold and the silence, heard the footsteps of these strangers before he saw them. Later, he would learn that they were priests and nuns of the Synod of Strategic Prophecy, sent to find those who had been touched by the voice of God. Though at that time, the boy knew little of the world beyond the walls of his cell. By this point, the boy had long since entered a constant state of prayer, his lips moving ceaselessly as he fought to keep his mind intact. Sleep had abandoned him years ago. Only brief, restless moments of unconsciousness offered him fleeting peace. The only times he would rise from his position of supplication were to take the small meals the nuns provided, as he had been taught that his life and body was God's gift of creation, and that it should always be cared for and never spurned. Even with this pious dedication, the visions would sometimes come in force, overwhelming his fragile composure. During these episodes, he would awaken to find himself restrained, arms and legs bound to keep him from harm, while the nuns prayed over him, their soft words an anchor in the sea of divine voices. For months, the agents of the Synod did not reveal themselves to the boy. Instead, they observed him. They were patient as they searched for signs that the boy could hear the voice of God and was not simply insane. They listened to the words he said as he prayed. They read the nuns' records of the boy's visions. They had the nuns expose the boy to various relics and other holy items to see how he would react. They grew more excited as the boy passed each of the tests, eventually meeting with him, though his memories of those early days are sparse, as his hold on consciousness was ever a tentative thing. The nuns of the sanitarium wept as they took custody of the boy and gave thanks that his suffering had not been for naught. The agents of the synod used powerful drugs to sedate the boy as they took him from the sanitarium. As they moved him, he experienced a semblance of true rest for the first time in his young life. Even then, his sleep was a fitful thing. Under the watchful gaze of his new minders, the boy twitched and thrashed in his sleep as he whispered of things to come and things that have already passed. Only when they entered the valley of the word did the boy go still. The boy was woken and brought out of the transport to find himself on the side of a valley. One of the priests that had brought him here explained that this was the valley of the word, the secret headquarters and spiritual heart of the synod of strategic prophecy. Here, the very stones seemed to amplify the divine echoes, and some claimed it was the place where creation itself had begun. The air felt heavy with a presence that stripped away all falsehoods and illusions, forcing the boy to bow his head in instinctive reverence. Before him stretched a vast expanse filled with antennae and satellite dishes, listening posts and cloisters where the voices of the heavens were drawn down to earth. The boy shivered in the gaze of eternity, his mind reeling from the weight of the valley's unending prayer. But he understood, even in his confusion, that this was a place unlike any other, a place where the whispers he had always heard might finally find their purpose. Though there was an unmistakable power within the valley, the boy felt oddly comfortable, as if the pressure of the air around him matched the same pressure that had been building within him since birth. They were approached by a man in robes. From a distance, he appeared to be a monk, but as he drew closer, the boy saw that most of the man's skull had been replaced by a silver receptor. Though the man's eyes had been removed during his augmentation, he moved directly to the boy and bowed his head reverently. "Go with the receptor," one of the priests intoned softly. "He will take you to your new home." The boy nodded, the words carrying an authority that seemed to come from beyond the man himself. He followed the receptor, who moved with the quiet assurance of one who had long ago relinquished their own will to something greater. Without another word, the boy began the descent to the valley floor. As they walked further down, they paused at a terrace overlooking the valley floor. There, a group of figures drilled in martial combat, clad in simple, dark robes and wearing the bizarre helmets that shimmered with metals the boy had never seen before. The figures moved with impossible precision. Each step was deliberate. Each motion flowed like water as they perfectly positioned themselves to be in the right place at the right moment. The boy watched in awe as they weaved in and out of each other's strikes, their movements guided by the invisible thread of the voice of God. The display was at once both terrifying and beautiful, a testament to the discipline and focus of God's servants. For a moment, the boy forgot the weight of the valley and the fear of what lay ahead, his young mind mesmerized by the elegance of their art. Despite the unmistakable aura, a divinity that radiated within the valley of the word, the boy's connection to the voice of God was once again slowly beginning to overwhelm him. The rest of the journey was a blur as the boy fought to retain his sanity. He was brought to what would become his dormitory, a small building that was but a single room. It was covered in arcane technology that contrasted starkly with the empty interior. It was not unlike his old cell at the sanitarium, yet this was engineered to such a degree that its interior was truly cut off from the outside world. The boy entered his new cell, and the receptor sealed the door behind him. As the heavy door closed with a resonant thud, the boy was cut off from all outside stimuli. The thick walls of his cell blocked every sound, every vibration, every hint of light, leaving only silence in its purest, most absolute form. For the first time in his life, he felt an alien sense of peace descend upon him. If it were not for the ever-present voice of God, the complete and unbroken stillness would likely have driven him mad. Days passed in absolute stillness. The only sound within the cell was the rhythm of his own breath and the ever-present voice of God. In these quiet hours, he found that, with great focus and constant prayer, he could extract the smallest fragments of clarity from the divine echoes, a single thread of understanding woven amidst the torrent. It was a fragile mastery, but one that filled his heart with a sense of purpose and hope, a promise of something greater still to come. After a week of ceaseless prayer, he was visited by the artificers of the calefactory, who brought with them an oculus helm, a device of intricate beauty and terrifying purpose. Forged from pure orichalcum and etched with prayers, it was a masterpiece of the synod's artisans, designed to attune the wearer's mind to the divine echoes. For days, the artificers worked in silent reverence, modifying and adjusting the helm to best help the boy extract clarity from the endless voice of God. They murmured prayers and recited verses as they carefully fitted the contraption to his skull, the cool weight of orichalcum pressing down like the hand of God itself. Each adjustment sent faint ripples of pressure through the boy's mind, and he felt as though the helm was burrowing into his very soul. When at last they were satisfied, the engineers left him alone in the stillness. The helm rested upon his head like a crown of devotion, and with it came a terrible clarity. Each word of the voice of God, now a ringing bell in the silence. His mind expanded and contracted with each breath, and though the torrent of visions threatened to drown him, he found that the helm allowed him, with great focus and prayer, to draw forth threads of understanding that had once eluded him. It was an agony and a blessing, a constant reminder of the burden he must bear and the purpose he must fulfill. The next day, after a receptor brought the boy his morning meal, he was led back to the courtyard where he had seen the observers practicing. Before, their movements had seemed inhuman, each strike and motion seemingly beyond mortal comprehension, a dance that in its perfection approached the divine. Now, with the oculus helm upon his own brow, the boy saw them with new eyes, eyes attuned to the voice of God. The helm revealed to him the threads of fate that the observers followed. Through the crystalline eye of God, he saw how each step was perfectly aligned with an invisible path, how each strike resonated with the sacred geometry of the divine will. Though their movements were impossibly precise, he now saw the mortal strain in every motion, the subtle trembling of muscles, the quiet gasps of breath, and the effort it took to maintain harmony with the endless litany of the divine echo. He watched with reverence and awe, for the helm allowed him to glimpse not only the perfect choreography of the faithful, but also the pain and sacrifice that lay beneath it. In that moment, he understood that they were not inhuman at all. They were mortal men and women who had surrendered every earthly distraction to become vessels of the voice of God. And he, too, was now a part of that holy design, a promise of what he might yet become. His life became a cycle of prayer and meditation. Each day he would bow his head, repeating the prayers he had learned as a child, his lips moving with a fervor born of both desperation and devotion. The silence of the cell became both his torment and his refuge. Alone with the voice of God, he struggled to separate the divine truths from the endless echoes of creation. Yet as the days turned to weeks, he found that in that silence he could glean fleeting glimpses of clarity, threads of understanding that shone like stars in the endless night. But prayer and meditation alone would not suffice. The observers required not only purity of spirit, but also strength of body. The receptors led him from his cell each day to the courtyard, where under the watchful gaze of the saints, he began his martial training. His arms ached as he learned the weight of the trench polearm, and his muscles burned as he mimicked the precise movements of the observers. It was a painful, grueling process, but the boy embraced it. For in each motion, each carefully measured breath, he felt a flicker of the divine geometry that the helm had revealed to him. Yet he found that he could only follow the threads of prophecy for scant moments before they slipped away, lost in the endless tide of the voice of God. The line between prayer and battle blurred until they became one, his body moving in harmony for fleeting seconds before his concentration slipped, and the divine clarity was lost once more. As the weeks turned to months, the boy's training continued relentlessly. Each morning, he rose from his simple cot to pray, then took his meal from the silent receptor. The receptors led him down to the training grounds, where the courtyard rang with the clash of pole arms and the rhythmic footfalls of the observers. Yet even amidst the disciplined routine, the boy noticed that sometimes the observers would be called away from the valley. He would watch as they left, their oculus helms reflecting the morning light like holy relics. Days later, they would return, battered and bloodied, robes torn and their faces hidden behind the cold, impassive oculus helms. Though he could not see their eyes, the boy could sense the weight of the battles they had endured, etched into their very posture and the slow, deliberate movements of their battered forms. Some did not return at all. The boy felt a quiet dread and awe as he watched these warriors of prophecy. They were not merely monks, but weapons in the hand of God. It was a grim reminder that his training would lead him beyond the valley's walls one day, to battlefields where the echoes of the divine and the screams of the damned mingled as one. In those moments of observing the observer's departures and return, he saw the mortal cost of serving the voice of God. Yet he also saw their unwavering faith, the way their wounds were bound with quiet prayers, and how they never faltered in their devotion. The boy knew that one day he, too, would carry that burden into the world beyond the valley. Years had passed since the boy was first taken into the valley, and he had grown into a young man, a man of quiet purpose and steady resolve. The long hours of prayer and meditation had shaped his spirit, and the days spent wielding the trench polearm had hardened his body. Each dawn began with solemn prayer in his cell, the whispers of the voice of God resonating more clearly in his mind. He had learned to quiet the endless echoes and listen for the subtle truths hidden within them, though the threads of fate he grasped were fragile and fleeting. When he followed them, his movements in the training yard were no longer mere mimicry, but a dance of devotion and prophecy. He could almost feel the divine geometry guiding his strikes, his breath synchronizing with the rhythm of the eternal word. Yet the clarity was never complete. Even as he moved in harmony for moments at a time, the overwhelming tide of the voice would surge back and shatter his focus. He would falter, the threads slipping from his mind's grasp, and he would once again be forced to bow his head in prayer, seeking forgiveness for his weakness, though the time between these lapses had grown longer and longer. Despite these stumbles, he pressed on. The courtyard had become a crucible of faith and steel, each training session a test of both body and soul. He knew that the path of the observer was not one of comfort. It was a life of discipline and sacrifice. The young observer's days settled into a cycle of constant meditation, only pausing his tireless prayers and training to take his meal from his attendant receptor. This was the only time he would remove the oculus helm. He ate with deliberate movements, his mind still half attuned to the ceaseless voice that never truly left him. He had grown detached from the world around him, the silent receptors, the priests and nuns of the various monasteries. He barely noticed them anymore. Their faces and voices had become little more than echoes in his mind, fleeting and unimportant compared to the divine echoes that filled his days. He preferred the sensory deprivation of his cell. The quiet isolation allowed him to focus completely, shutting out all distractions so that he could draw what clarity he could from the eternal voice. Only in that silence, with nothing but the pulse of his own breath and the ever-present murmur of prophecy, did he feel truly aligned with the purpose of his existence, though the price of that alignment was a profound and all-consuming solitude. Though the young observer lived in near-complete solitude, as his mastery of the voice of God deepened, his understanding of the wider world began to sharpen. Through the veil of divine echoes, visions flooded his mind, fractured, radiant glimpses of a world engulfed in sacred war. They came not as dreams, but as truths laid bare through prayer, revelation pouring into his soul like oil upon fire. He saw the brave and beleaguered defenders of New Antioch locked in endless struggle, their trenches carved into the bones of a ruined world, banners raised high against the choking darkness. He saw the enigmatic agents of the Iron Sultanate, cloaked in smoke and flame, emerging from behind the sheltering bastions of the Iron Wall, to enact the unknowable will of their sovereign. He saw the lords of the north bracing at the rim of damnation, preparing each dawn to throw back the horrors that spewed from the helmet like bile from a cursed wound. And far across the sea, wrapped in fog and gunmetal prayers, he glimpsed the great moving fortress of Britannia. It crawled across the blighted landscape, smoke-stacked and eternal, a bastion of resolve shielding the British Isles from the corrupted winds that howled just beyond its walls. These visions came unbidden, summoned not by desire, but by divine necessity. And though he could not touch these places, nor ever speak to those who fought there, the young observer felt their weight in his soul. They were threads of prophecy, strands of the greater war, and he was not apart from it, but intricately bound to its unfolding purpose. On the eve of his 20th year, the young observer was stirred from his meditation by a vision more violent and urgent than any he had yet known. It did not rise slowly from the murmur of divine echoes, as they often did, but instead tore into his mind like a blade, demanding his attention with such force that he fell to his knees. His breath caught, as images flooded the interior of his oculus helm. Not with sight, but with terrible knowing. A great front, far from the valley of the word, crumbled beneath the fury of heretical assault. The cries of the dying echoed within his soul, each one a thread unraveling from the tapestry of divine order. He saw faithful soldiers clad in the armor of the church, scrambling through smoke-filled trenches. Their formations broke, their lines buckled, and in the chaos, the voice of God was drowned in blood and screams. He trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what he saw. A single moment out of sequence, a failure to follow the thread, and thousands of lives lost to flame and steel. The vision burned into his mind the image of a beacon shattering atop a hill, the bearer dead before his body struck the mud, and the demonic tide sweeping through the breach. He felt the crushing silence of divine absence in that moment. not because the voice had failed, but because the faithful had not heard it clearly enough. When he emerged from the vision, sweat poured from beneath the rim of his helm. He collapsed to the floor of his cell, the breath knocked from his lungs by the violence of the prophecy. And yet, the voice did not stop. It continued to speak, not with words, but with sacred consequence. Every soul lost that day etched upon his heart like scripture. He lay there for hours, trembling in silence. The threads of fate frayed at the edges of his mind. He knew then that this was not just a message. It was a summons. His training was not yet complete, but the world beyond the valley had shifted. And somewhere, far from his cloistered solitude, the armies of the faithful would falter, and the synod would demand an answer. By the time dawn broke over the valley of the Word, the young observer was already moving. Meditation had eluded him entirely. The remnants of the vision coiled like smoke in his thoughts. He knelt in the center of his cell, motionless, save for the faint movements of his lips as he recited scripture. The voice had not ceased since the vision. It spoke not in urgency but in inevitability, a commandment carved in silence. When the receptor arrived that morning, the observer did not wait for the meal. Instead, he stood and bowed his head in silent acknowledgement. The receptor, a veteran of many years, seemed to understand. Wordlessly, he turned and led the observer out of the cell. Together, they descended to the armory buried beneath the valley floor. The chamber was dim and cold, lit only by flickering candelabras and the soft glow of sanctified circuitry embedded in the walls. There, under the watch of guardian statues and forgotten saints, the young observer was guided to the place where the weapons of his order were kept. His trench polearm awaited him, hung upon a rack as if part of the wall itself. He lifted it reverently. The haft was blackened steel bound in sacred leather, the blade etched with the symbols of Christendom. It was perfectly balanced, its weight a familiar presence, its reach an extension of his will. Next came the armor, dark robes reinforced with blessed mail and thin armor plates, designed for mobility and precision. Every inch was blessed, every layer stitched with whispered liturgy. The oculus helm he wore was already attuned, already singing its chorus of divine resonance. But today, the song had changed. It was no longer an endless murmur. It was a summons. Once fully garbed, the observer ascended the tower path. He passed the cloisters, walked beneath the sprawling arms of the Temple of the Word, and emerged upon the overlook where the valley spread beneath him. The world beyond called, cloaked in fire and prayer. There was no ceremony, no farewell, only the still presence of the receptor and the silent understanding shared between the faithful. The observer stepped beyond the valley's bounds and into the world he had never truly known. The threads of fate tugged at him, unseen but unrelenting. His feet moved without doubt, guided by prophecy. The vision would become reality unless he could reach it in time. And so he began the long journey through fields scorched by war and roads forgotten by peace, every breath an echo of the divine, every step in lockstep with the will of God. The journey passed in a blur of prophecy. As the observer crossed fields of blackened soil and dead men's bones, he gave himself over wholly to the voice of God. Time no longer moved in the rhythm of sun and moon, but in the rise and fall of divine instruction. He neither slept nor paused, save to kneel in reverent prayer or take what meager nourishment his body required. The world around him became a haze, the war-torn landscape shifting and folding under the weight of his single-minded devotion. The horizon burned in the distance. Convoys of the faithful passed him by, unaware of his identity or his burden. He did not speak. He did not look up. He walked as one possessed. His movements pulled along invisible lines woven into the fabric of creation. The oculus helm burned upon his brow, the eye of God showing him paths hidden to mortal men. Shortcuts across ruined battlefields, safe passages through heretic patrols, crumbling cathedrals where forgotten saints whispered guidance in the rubble. Distant storms thundered and battles raged, but none touched him. He strode on through silence, his trench pole arm in hand, robes marked by travel and devotion. He no longer felt hunger nor fear. His body ached, but his will did not falter. His soul, long honed through isolation and agony, was steel wrapped in litany. And then, without warning, the air changed. The voice intensified, rising from murmur to chorus. The sky above churned with smoke and fire as the sounds of artillery and screams echoed in the valley before him. He had reached the front. Stretching before him were the broken lines of Christendom's defenders. Trenches collapsed beneath the weight of enemy shell fire. Craters filled with the blood of the faithful. The very vision that had torn into his mind nights before now lay sprawled out before his feet, real, terrible, and unfolding. He halted at the ridge, overlooking the battlefield. The eye of God pulsed within his helm, whispering of 1,000 futures. His fingers clenched the haft of his weapon. The threads of fate reached for him, and he stepped forward, not as a child dragged from a sanitarium, nor as a student of the synod, but as an observer, alone, at the edge of the world, ready to do the will of God. The mud sucked at his boots as the observer descended from the ridge into the trenches. The scent of blood, cordite, and rot choked the air, mingling with the faint tang of incense that clung to the remnants of shattered altars and broken reliquaries. Every step deeper into the trenchworks pulled him from the abstract clarity of vision into the grim weight of reality. The defenders of New Antioch were hollow-eyed and gaunt, their armor scuffed and scorched, their hands trembling even when at rest. Many bore fresh bandages soaked through with blood, and others stared into nothingness, their minds lost somewhere far beyond the gunfire. The observer passed them like a wraith, silent and steady, guided by the whispering threads of prophecy only he could see. They did not speak to him. Some averted their eyes. Others simply watched, as if unsure whether the figure before them was man or angel. His oculus helm glinted dully in the ashen gloom, and those few brave enough to look into the eye of God turned away almost immediately, as if burned by its presence. The trenches were in ruin. Sandbags burst open, wooden supports shattered, and the dugouts collapsed. Fire-blackened corpses were half buried in the mire, clutching rosaries and rusted rifles. He moved past medics praying over the dying and field chaplains administering last rites between bombardments. Everywhere he went, he saw the unraveling of a line once held with honor. These were the faithful, and they had fought like lions, but now they were frayed and faltering. The voice of God surged in his helm, guiding his steps. He touched the shoulder of a weeping soldier and moved on. He paused to whisper a verse over a dying man, who clutched his trench knife until his final breath. This was not yet the place of miracles. This was the place of reckoning. And the observer had arrived in the hour of despair, bearing not comfort, but correction. The threads of fate still danced in the mud and blood. It was his charge to follow them, to weave order back into the frayed edges of God's plan. He did not hesitate. He walked deeper into the trenches, toward the breach that had yet to come. The observer moved with unerring certainty, guided not by maps or reports, but by the chorus within his helm, the sacred resonance that pulled him onward. He stepped over broken boards and bodies, through puddles that reflected a sky still split by artillery flashes, until he reached the point where he knew the next blow would fall. It was a junction of trenches, half collapsed and strewn with the dead. A few surviving defenders lingered there, crouched behind ruined barricades, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Most had stopped praying. Their faith had not faltered, but it had withered beneath the weight of too many days without hope. The observer said nothing at first. He simply stood in the center of the junction, his trench pole arm held vertically, like a banner of judgment. The eye of God in his helm pulsed with divine urgency, his head tilted, listening not to the men around him, but to the currents of fate as they spiraled tighter and tighter around this place. The voice rose in his mind, louder, clearer, more insistent than ever before. It burned through the echoes and noise, a note of absolute truth ringing in the silence between heartbeats. He turned toward the soldiers, many of whom had begun to watch him with wary eyes. Some looked on in fear, others in awe. His voice, when it came, rang like a bell tolling across a battlefield. Have faith. It was not a request. It was a command, imbued with the resonance of the divine, the words shaped and amplified by the sacred construction of his oculus helm. The men flinched and then stilled. Even the wind seemed to pause. In that single phrase, something ignited, a spark buried beneath despair catching flame. The observer remained at the junction, silent and still, even as the wind returned and the world resumed its tremble. Yet within the sacred hum of his helm something shifted. A veil lifted. The eye of God began to show him with startling clarity the near futures that spiraled out from this very point, from this patch of bloodied earth, where resolve had been all but spent. He saw it unfold. The heretic forces, twisted and howling, their flesh daubed in profane symbols, mustering in the blackened ruins beyond the ridge. He could see them now, not as a vision, but as a certainty. Massing behind smoke and shattered stone, their ranks teeming with aberrant machines and unclean sorceries. Their next push would come with thunder and madness. And still, in the midst of this darkness, the observer's mind opened further. He beheld a convoy of reinforcements crawling through ravaged countryside, fresh troops from New Antioch, weary but determined, banners flapping in soot-choked air. He saw their eyes brimming with faith and resolve, their rifles clutched tight, their boots dragging through mud. They would arrive within the hour, but they would arrive too late. If the breach came before them, if the heretics overwhelmed this position, the newcomers would walk straight into a massacre. There would be no time to dig in, no time to form lines, no space for strategy or preparation. He saw their deaths scattered like seeds in the mud, each one a soul extinguished before it could serve its divine purpose. And yet, in the web of futures that sprawled before him, there flickered a narrow path. It wound between annihilation and salvation, a thread as thin as a hair and as sharp as judgment. The observer stepped forward, gripping his pole arm, and allowed the voice of God to surge fully into his mind. His body trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of divine intention. He knew what must be done. The line must hold. The breach must be sealed, even if only for moments, moments enough for the future to take root. His steps carried him to the trench's edge, his gaze fixed on the burning horizon where prophecy now demanded blood. The trench behind him whispered of doubt, but the voice of God roared with purpose. The observer stood alone at the brink, the mud of the last redoubt clinging to his boots as he gazed across no man's land. Smoke curled from shattered earth, and the black horizon pulsed with the malice of heresy. He had seen this moment, in dreams, in visions, in the depths of his cell, and now it stood before him like a scripture yet to be written. The wind bit at his robes, dragging cords of ash and embers across the broken landscape. But within the sanctum of his oculus helm, the eye of God opened wide. Threads of possible futures shimmered across the battlefield, like strands of light spun through fog. Some ended in fire, others in silence. A few, only a few, glowed with the golden certainty of divine will. He stepped from the trench. The soldiers behind him murmured, unsure if they were witnessing an act of madness or a miracle. He did not turn. Each footfall landed upon soil chosen by prophecy. Each breath synced with the eternal rhythm of the divine. Across the blasted field, the heretics stirred. Warped silhouettes moved behind burned-out tanks and collapsed bunkers. They sensed something, not a man, but a ripple in their fates. Some pointed, others raised rifles, but none advanced, not yet. The observer walked onward, his heart beat in harmony with the litany that filled his mind. The voice of God was no longer fragmented or distant. It was with him, within him, flowing through his limbs like blood and fire. Every step echoed with sacred consequence. He crested a ridge of churned earth, the trench vanishing behind him, the enemy lines spread wide before. His presence turned the battlefield into a crucible. Here the tide would break or turn. The moment had arrived, the narrow thread upon which the future now hung. The heretic saw him clearly now. A lone figure in darkened robes, his oculus helm gleaming with sacred fire, stepped through the curtain of smoke that divided the trench from the killing field. For a heartbeat, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Then they opened fire. The first bullets sang past his ears. The observer did not flinch. He broke into a run, each step guided by the voice of God, his trench polearm held low and steady. His focus narrowed to a singular point, the thread of prophecy winding through the chaos ahead. The voice of God surged, no longer a whisper, but a thunderous chorus that flooded his senses. Shots screamed through the air, but he twisted and dipped with impossible grace, blowing between the paths of incoming fire. The eye of God burned in his helm, not only showing him where each bullet would land, but when. Time itself fractured into clear possibilities, futures opening and closing in the space of a heartbeat. He followed only one, the golden thread that led toward salvation. Explosions burst to his left. Mortar fire cratered the earth at his feet. Shrapnel lanced past his shoulders. But he kept moving. His every breath was a prayer, his every stride a vow. He danced through death like a candle flame in a storm, unextinguished, untouchable. The heretics howled. They redoubled their fire, seized not merely by bloodlust but by an all-consuming hatred. They despised him more than any mortal foe, for through his helm rang the pure cadence of the voice of God, a sound that to their blighted ears scorched like judgment. His presence was not just divine, it was anathema. Their weapons did not falter, but their certainty did, shaken by the undeniable truth that he was the harbinger of holy wrath. The observer ran with the momentum of inescapable fate. His polearm whirled to deflect a sniper's bullet, his body turning with the rhythm of prophecy. The battlefield bent around him as he ran an impossible path through incoming fire. He saw the gathering point of the heretics, a mass of writhing forms and twisted machines coiling behind a ridge of scorched rubble, where they were mustering their strength for the next assault. The voice guided his gaze to the center of their formation, where banners of blasphemy waved over shrieking fanatics and lumbering figures covered in blackened armor. It was there the breach would come. Behind him, the reinforcements from New Antioch pressed onward, still too distant, still too unready. The voice whispered that this was the fulcrum. Here, in the crucible of fire and prophecy, the future trembled on the edge of a blade. The ridge loomed ahead, and the observer surged toward it, the roar of heretic fire rising like the screams of the damned. He did not slow. The eye of God blazed with prophetic fire, casting golden threads through the haze of war. Paths woven through judgment and ruin, all pointing forward to the mustering point. The lines of fate drew him onward, not away from death, but into the heart of it. Ahead, the barbed wire gleamed, a jagged wall of rust and malice. The observer's pace never faltered. With a sudden burst of speed, he drove his trench pole arm into the earth and vaulted high into the air. Time stretched thin as he soared. Bullets stitched the air beneath him, but none found flesh. He cleared the wire in a blur of tattered robes and sacred purpose, landing hard on the other side, knee striking mud as the hiss of the damned rose to meet him. He had breached the heretic trench. Before they could react, he moved. The dance began. A ballet of annihilation, guided not by instinct, but by the ceaseless song of prophecy. The polearm spun in his hands, its blade an arc of judgment. He struck low, severing the leg of a charging fanatic. He turned, driving the butt of the weapon into the chest of an armor-clad brute, caving in its ribcage with a crunch of sacred steel. The trench erupted around him. Heretics screamed, firing wildly, swinging axes and knives, but he was already gone, moving through them like wind through reeds. Every parry, every strike, followed the thread seen only through the eye of God. He moved preternatural speed and impossible precision. His blade always where it must be, his body always absent from the line of fire. One raised a relic wreathed in flame, but he was already behind them. The blade slid through flesh and bone with a wet hiss. Another lunged with a crude bayonet. He pivoted and drove the polearm through their throat, pulling it free in a spray of dark ichor. The trench narrowed. He advanced, unrelenting. The voice of God roared in his helm, a tide of visions and commandment. His limbs ached with the strain of channeling so many possibilities, but he held firm. The battlefield twisted to match his steps. Heretics died screaming. There was the unblinking eye of God. He moved deeper, the trench walls pressing tighter, the air thick with blood and smoke. The voice of God still thundered in his mind, but the threads it offered became tangled. As he pressed forward, the sheer strain of maintaining focus began to gnaw at his resolve. Where once he had danced between the threads of prophecy, now the path seemed to fracture, splintering into possibilities that wavered like heat mirages. Still he fought. The observer lashed out with his trench polearm, cleaving through heretic flesh with a mechanical precision. A brute charged him. He ducked beneath the swing of a rusted cleaver and gutted the creature in a single fluid thrust. The eye of God glowed hot upon his brow, showing him where to move, when to strike. But the intervals between its clarity lengthened. The divine symphony became erratic, and doubt, like a hairline crack in glass, spread across his concentration. A gunshot rang. The observer twisted, but too late. A round clipped his shoulder, spinning him into the trench wall. He grunted, more in frustration than pain. For a heartbeat, The voice faltered, flickered. The threads vanished. He dropped to a knee, shielding himself with the haft of his polearm as another barrage struck the mud around him. He forced himself to stillness. With clenched teeth he whispered a litany beneath his breath, grounding himself in the repetition of holy words. The eye of God flickered, then flared. Threads reappeared, and with a cry, he surged back into motion. Another heretic fell, then another. But the toll was mounting. Another slip. A bayonet scored his side. He retaliated with brutal force, crushing his assailant beneath a downward arc that split skull and helm alike. Blood poured from his wounds, soaking his robes. Each blow now came at a cost. But he did not stop. Even as the divine light flickered and flared, even as the voice wavered between silence and command, the observer pressed forward. He was more than flesh now. He was prophecy given form. And if he must die here, he would do so on the blade's edge of God's will, a final punctuation mark upon the battlefield. The trench twisted again, and he pushed into its heart, his movements ragged but relentless. Heretics surged in from all sides, howling in defiance, but the observer met them with the grace of a prophet and the fury of a crusader. Each kill became harder, not for lack of will, but for the growing fog at the edge of his mind. The voice, once so clear, began to sound as it once did when he was a boy in a sanatorium. Words overlapped, futures blurred. He felt his body weaken with each wound, his spirit taxed by the ceaseless demands of prophecy. Still, he endured. He was the bridge across which the faithful might live. He was the dam against the tide. He plunged deeper where the enemy numbers swelled. Things that were once men but were now beasts born of heresy. His polearm carved wide arcs, the sacred movements of his training etched into muscle memory. He struck low, rose with a twisting slice, turned with a feint that opened a throat. Every movement a prayer, every death a sacrifice. But he was tiring, and with exhaustion came imperfection. One blow struck true, a jagged blade biting into his thigh. He screamed, not in pain, but in defiance, and cut down the wielder with savage force. He staggered back, panting, helm ringing with chaotic futures. Another enemy rushed him, and he barely turned in time to intercept. The voice crackled, the threads flickered. And yet, between the pain and confusion, moments of divine clarity returned. As if spurred by his suffering, the eye of God burst forth with flashes of purpose, windows into futures still unmade. In these brief glimpses, he moved again with grace, striking with precision. The battle became a tide, and he its lone defiance. The trench twisted into a kill zone, its walls stained dark with blood and fire. The observer fought not as a soldier, but as divine will incarnate. His body a holy text written in blade and breath. He pressed onward, following flickering strands that vanished as quickly as they appeared. When his focus returned, he was reborn. When it faltered, he bled. Another gunshot tore through his side. Another heretic screamed and died. The pattern continued, a rhythm of faith and failure, of miracle and mortal cost. He stumbled, caught himself, struck true again. The trench floor slicked beneath his boots, but he advanced, a living contradiction, broken yet indomitable, fading yet radiant. He was bleeding from half a dozen wounds now, breath shallow and ragged. But within the eye of God, a final thread glowed brighter than the rest. It led deeper still. And at the center of the storm, the observer waged war, half blind, half deaf, torn and bleeding, but wholly devoted. He was the blade of God, and though chipped and battered, he had not yet broken. The tremor came first, a low, guttural rumble that rolled through the ground like the warning breath of a sleeping giant. The observer, mid-strike, paused just long enough to feel the change. The voice surged in his mind, its cadence steadying, its threads knitting tighter, firmer. Then, like hammers from the heavens, the artillery came. Shells screamed through the air, their trails carving incandescent scars across the soot-colored sky. The first impact struck the trench behind him, a thunderous explosion that sent up geysers of earth and bone. The ground convulsed, men howled. A shrieking wind followed in the wake of falling steel. And yet, the observer stood unharmed. He pivoted, weaving to the left as the eye of God showed him the moment before the next shell struck. The blast rocked the corridor he had just passed through. The voice had returned, not in its fractured stammer, but in full divine resonance. He could see it clearly now, a golden thread through chaos, a shifting path through destruction. The heretics around him scattered like insects caught beneath a torchlight. The barrage shattered their cohesion. Some threw themselves into the mud, clutching their heads. Others ran blindly, abandoning their positions, screaming at shadows. Leaders bellowed for order, firing lines disintegrated. The trench devolved into a brawl of panic and rage. The observer moved through it all like a blade of stillness, each footfall a note in the divine rhythm. Where others stumbled, he advanced. Where heretics clashed and stumbled over one another, he passed untouched. The voice guided him with perfect timing. Step, pause, turn. A shell hit just behind him, flinging dirt and shattered bone past his shoulder. Another cratered the trench wall beside him, but he was already clear of its reach. One heretic, half mad with fear and bloodlust, lunged at him with a shriek. The observer pivoted, buried his polearm in the attacker's chest, and yanked it free in time to sidestep a falling timber. A moment later, another shell collapsed the rear section of the trench, cutting off pursuit. The observer did not hesitate. He emerged into a clearing just as the barrage reached its crescendo, a thunderous storm of divine fire and human desperation. All around him, the trench line buckled under the weight of confusion. The heretics were not gone, not yet, but they were scattered, leaderless, unraveling. And in that moment, the pressure on the observer lessened. He could breathe again, if only for a few seconds. The thread still shimmered in his vision, pulling him forward, deeper. His wound screamed, his limbs burned. But now the way was open. He took a step forward, then another. The ringing in his ears was beginning to fade when he heard them. Not the guttural howls of heretics, but clear, thunderous voices crying out in tongues familiar and holy. Battle cries, shouts of righteous fury. Names of saints and martyrs echoed off trench walls. At first, he thought it a hallucination, another ripple in his fractured focus. But then he saw them. Through the haze and drifting smoke, figures surged forward, clad in the colors of New Antioch. Their coats and armor bore the insignia of the faithful. Bayonets glinted, rifles roared. They had not stopped to relieve the line. They had gone beyond it. Instead of entrenching, they had advanced. The reinforcements had not halted at their own bunkers. They had taken the confusion wrought by the observer, the broken cohesion of the heretics, the smoke, the sudden chaos of the barrage, and turned it into momentum. They had launched a counter-assault. The observer watched them pour into the trench, spilling over the edge like a flood. They met the disoriented heretics with a fury born of faith and desperation. Blades flashed, gunfire cracked, screams rang out on both sides. The battle became a storm, swirling around the observer, who now stood not as the lone line of resistance, but as the tip of the spear. One of the soldiers, face soot-streaked and helmet cracked, looked at him and paused. There was no question, no command. The look was one of recognition, of awe. The voice of God hummed softly now, like a hymn beneath the din of war, not deafening, not frantic, but steady, encouraging, affirming. He was on the path. He had altered the lines of fate, and the faithful had come. His limbs trembled from exhaustion. Blood seeped from the wounds beneath his robes, but still he lifted his polearm. Still he turned and began the long walk back toward the friendly lines. Each step was labored, his wounds pulsing with pain, but he did not falter. He had seen the new futures branching outward. No longer paths of doom, but of resistance, of survival. That was enough. The trench was far from secure. The battle raged on, but others now carried the fight, their spirits kindled by his presence. And the voice, no longer a storm, whispered like a benediction. It is enough for now. Return. The journey back to the Valley of the Word took nearly twice as long as his original departure, where once he had moved like a determined man driven by duty and conviction. Now each step was a negotiation between pain and will. His robes, stiff with dried blood, clung to him like a funeral shroud. The wound in his thigh reopened more than once, forcing him to stop beneath shattered trees or beside ruined chapels, kneeling in the dirt to bind it again with whatever cloth he could tear from his undershirt. There were no hymns to accompany him now, only the wind and the distant echoes of war. Yet the voice of God remained, not as the blazing commandment of battle, but as a low and steady murmur, like water flowing over ancient stone. It no longer issued visions or threads of light, but it did not fall silent. It stayed with him, a companion in the silence, guiding him through the haze of blood loss and fatigue. He skirted far from the roads and ruins, favoring the quiet places where no footsteps echoed and no eyes followed. Where others might seek shelter or companionship, he kept to the wilds, thickets of frost-bitten trees, winding glens, and forgotten paths. He passed no travellers. He saw no souls. There was comfort in the solitude, in the silence broken only by wind and breath. The polearm he leaned upon was no longer a weapon, but a walking staff, a necessary brace for a man worn thin by faith and pain. He welcomed the stillness, the distance from all human voices save the one within his helm. Each night he rested in solitude, curling into himself on damp earth, letting the cold bite at his wounds. He did not build fires. He needed no warmth. The valley called to him, and finally, after what felt like an age, he saw the distant peaks that crowned the hidden gorge. The Valley of the Word, its stones humming faintly with divine resonance, waited like an open psalter beneath the twilight sky. The closer he drew, the louder the voice became, rising not in command, but in welcome. He limped onward through the gates of stone, toward silence, toward purpose, toward the cloister that had given him shape. The moment he stepped past the threshold of the outer cloister, the cold weight of pain seemed to lift, if only slightly. Receptors greeted him in silence, their faces expressionless, their movements precise and unhurried. They did not ask questions. They did not speak. They simply guided him with gentle gestures toward the infirmary halls that lay within one of the valley's numerous monasteries. Here, his wounds were cleaned and bound. He is given healing tonics and sedatives that quiet the voice of God and give his body the rest it desperately needs. Thin, quiet prayers were murmured by the nuns tending to him to ease the mind during the pain. His armor and pole arm were taken from him with delicate ceremony, handled with reverence. The care he received was as much ritual as his own endless meditations. Receptors moved around him like a practiced machine, closing wounds, repairing muscle, cleansing infection. He bore it all in silence, eyes closed, speaking no word until they finished. When he was strong enough to stand, they escorted him through the quiet passageways of the monastery and returned him to his cell. As the door sealed behind him, the quiet rushed in like an old friend. The stone walls welcomed him with the same monastic indifference they had always offered. Here, in this place without sound or warmth, he found his peace once again. He lowered himself onto the prayer mat, bandaged limbs trembling, and let the silence wrap around him like a familiar cloak. His helm rested beside him, the eye of God dark for now, its visions withdrawn. Yet even without its guidance, he could still hear the faint, steady murmur of the voice, not commanding, but present. He exhaled. His body was broken, but his purpose was clear. And in the silence of the valley, he closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen.